12:07 a.m., Riley burst into our bedroom like someone had lit a fuse under her feet, and I still remember the sound of the door hitting the wall, the hollow thud that made my heart jump into my throat. She shoved a stack of paperback books onto the nightstand so hard the lamp wobbled and the cheap pages splayed like a deck of cards, bookmarks sticking out like flags. Before I could even ask what was happening, she hit play on that little Bluetooth speaker, and the walls started to hum with a man's voice talking, calm but urgent, about complete transparency like it was a religion. I stumbled out of bed, bare feet on cold tile that felt like a slab of ice against my soles, and the metallic taste of fear spread across my tongue before I even understood why my mouth was dry. Riley clapped her hands together like a child at a magic show while the podcast host promised brutal truth as a cure, as if honesty could be taken in a pill. She had bookmarks in every book, not just one, but 5 different little ribbons and sticky notes and highlighted passages, sentences underlined so hard the paper left tiny tears. The bass from the speaker made the bedside lamp vibrate, and I could see the shadow of the host's voice in the way Riley's lips moved when she repeated lines. No more lies, no more hiding. Total transparency starting now. The smell of printer ink and last night's wine mixed with the stale laundry scent of the room, creating a thin sharpness under my nose that made me want to back away. I don't think I breathed for a full minute. The clock over the dresser glowed 12:07 in cold green numbers, and my brain kept trying to translate that into something sensible. Tonight was supposed to be ordinary, a late show and some sleep. Instead, I watched Riley's face change from excited to fierce, as if she had found the answer to a problem she'd been chewing at in her head for months. She said it again, softer this time, like a benediction. This will save us. I heard the frame of the bed creak when I sat, and the blanket slipped off my legs and fell in a slow, wet felt thud. The idea of brutal honesty sounded noble in the podcast's echo, but in the dark of our room with the tiles cold under my feet, it sounded like detonating a fuse you didn't mean to light. She expected me to jump in right then to match her fevered certainty with my own immediate confession, and for a second my mouth opened and nothing came out. The metallic taste of fear was louder than the speaker, and I felt it in every tooth. I thought of tiny, private things, unfinished conversations about money, the way bills sometimes went unanswered, the laugh she made when some calls came in and she took them into the closet. I thought of how honesty could be a scalpel or a grenade. There are truths that clean and truths that blow the roof off a house. Riley folded her hands, eyes bright, and said, "Tell me everything, no exceptions." The words landed like a coin on a glass plate and vibrated there, precise and dangerous, and I realized then that one single midnight truth, spoken into a room humming with that podcast bass, could tear out the seams of everything I had ever thought steady. By 9 the next morning, I still hadn't slept more than catnaps, and by 6 I'd already replayed Riley's midnight manifesto a dozen times in my head, tasting that metallic fear like pennies under my tongue. We went through the day like people waiting for bad weather. Quiet, stiff smiles at the coffee shop, Riley pacing the living room with the podcast bookmarked on her phone, a stack of sticky notes peeking from her back pocket like little white flags. The Brookfield Club invitation sat on the kitchen counter with a gold-embossed edge and a reminder that tonight was Patricia and Edward's 25th anniversary, the very place Riley wanted to practice honesty in public, which in hindsight felt like choosing a cliff as your rehearsal stage. The club smelled the way country clubs do. Lemon polish on banisters, warm sourdough butter at the buffet, the faint chemical bleach from the bathrooms that hits the back of your throat when you step in. We walked in together with our faces on, like actors slipping into costumes, and Riley's hand tightened around mine for a second too long before she released me at the valet. The dining room had low chandeliers and a band warming up in the corner, a violin whispering under conversation that felt like static. When we sat, the first clink of cutlery felt like a test tone, a tuning fork for what was coming next, and I could taste horseradish on the amuse-bouche before the server even set it down. Riley cleared her throat and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She tapped her phone and said too loud for the table of 12, "Tonight we try honesty, no filters." There was a ripple of polite chuckles, the kind you make to fill an awkward room, and Patricia, her mother, gave a small, automatic smile that never made it to her mouth. I hadn't meant to agree because I knew how this could go, but the House of Moment pushed the rules on me. She had set the terms. I nodded because I am stubborn about keeping my word once I make it. I decided to start small, a testing stone into calm water. I lifted my fork, pressed the tip of it into a swirl of buttered toast the server had put beside my plate, felt the napkin rough under my palm, and then I said, "Your mom has always compared you to Mallory from college. She still does it. It makes you shrink." The word shrink hung between us like a dropped pin. The horseradish stung my tongue and nobody moved at first except Patricia, whose hands went white on the linen. Edward blinked like a man surprised he had ears. The comment landed like a pebble and made concentric rings. Patricia's mouth tightened, the couple across from us shifted in their chairs, and a waiter paused with a tray held perfectly balanced. Patricia's voice was thin when she answered, "Jason, that's mean," and everyone looked at me like I had spat into the soup. Riley's eyes were bright with something wild and triumphant, the smile of someone watching exactly what she predicted would happen. She whispered under the din, "Keep going," like a conductor tapping rhythm. So I kept going, testing the slope instead of the cliff, and the slope turned into a slide. I said, "Soft enough for some but loud enough for others. Last year at Edward's summer party, you walked up behind the server and put your hand on her waist in front of the pool. She froze and moved away. You called it a joke." The words ripped through the room slower than the first one, like when you drop a glass in a sink and it doesn't break until it hits the bottom. There was a sound then, not a gasp so much as a collective, breathy intake that felt like someone had opened the fire exit. Riley's hand flew to her mouth and she made a sound I didn't recognize, something between a laugh and a sob. Patricia's face went as red as the Merlot being poured at the table, and Edward's jaw moved like it was trying to catch words. Someone's phone vibrated and the band stopped playing. A woman near the corner said, "Oh my God," in a small voice, and that was all confirmation you needed that a private life had wandered into the public room and refused to leave quietly. Riley gasped at my tone as if I had grabbed the air out from under her, but then she squared her shoulders and reminded everyone, loud now, "I asked for this. No exceptions." Her insistence felt less like courage and more like flint striking steel, sparking inevitable heat. We sat there together at a table under a chandelier, silent for a second, tasting horseradish and fear and the copper tang of something about to split open. And I realized then it felt exactly like stepping off a cliff while your partner watches to make sure you both fall. It was 4:15 in the afternoon when Evan showed up, like he always did on a Sunday when the game felt important and the beer was cold in his backpack. The hallway still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and yesterday's coffee, and the television in the living room hummed a low, steady bass that kept the whole house on edge. Riley met him at the door with that bright, shiny grin she'd worn since the podcast took over her brain. And before coats were off, she was already telling him about our new rule like it was the best life hack she'd ever discovered. He laughed, dropped his bag on the floor, and we all moved closer to the couch where the screen glowed with a slow-motion replay and the bowl of chips on the coffee table sat cold and untouched. Riley couldn't help herself. She puffed up like someone wearing a new uniform and announced, loud enough for the TV's commentators to be drowned out, "We're doing radical honesty now. No more secrets, no filters." Evan's ears perked up more out of curiosity than alarm, and he clapped his hands once, like a man who likes drama in small doses but not the kind that sticks. He sat down, reached for a chip, and smiled at her like he always did when she told a joke that landed too dry for most people. I watched that smile because I knew it, had been on the receiving end 100 times, and I tasted the metallic fear again at the back of my teeth. I decided to test the policy in a way Riley hadn't planned for. I leaned back in my chair and said, casual, "Evan, you're here because you laugh at Riley's dry jokes and because you bring good beer, not because she adores you." The room shifted the way a warm pizza box shifts when you open it and find it empty. The TV's hum became a background drone and the chip bowl sounded like sand in an hourglass. Evan's polite smile did that tiny collapse thing people do when someone points out that the party was never really theirs, just a seat at the table. He laughed, a short, thin sound, and then looked at Riley like he was trying to read directions on a map that had changed overnight. Riley blinked and tried to make a joke of it, quick and light as if she could glue the moment back together with laughter. "Hey, he's my wingman," she said, but her voice trembled on the last word like a thread about to snap. Evan shifted in his seat, the top button of his shirt catching on his collarbone, and his eyes darted to the front door as if it suddenly seemed more interesting than the screen. I pulled the thread harder because that was the rule. Total transparency meant revealing things that made people uncomfortable, and I could feel the air thicken with unsaid measures. "Also," I said, keeping my voice slow so the words landed clean, "that promotion you bragged about, it's a title change, Evan. No raise, no extra budget, just a lateral move. They call it a promotion because it sounds better on your LinkedIn." Something in the room cracked like an old picture frame breaking at the corner. Evan's laugh vanished. His hand still hovered over the chips as if gravity hadn't decided where to pull it, and his polite smile was gone, replaced by an awkward silence that made the TV's commentators sound obscene for continuing to talk about touchdowns. Riley tried to cover again, a nervous laugh that died in her throat, but she was losing her public like a magician who'd shown the trick too early. Evan stood up, thanked us in a voice that was all consonants and no warmth, and left his beer cooler abandoned by the door. The door shut behind him with the kind of soft finality a judge uses for verdicts. The house felt colder after he left, like someone had opened all the windows and taken the heat with them. Riley said, "I told you this would make things clear," voice small now, and the sound of the television suddenly seemed obscene, a machine narrating a normal world we were no longer part of. I rinsed a glass in the sink and felt the smoothness of it like a small, honest object in my hand, steady and useful. The afternoon game went on the screen without us, the commentators describing plays as if the room hadn't shifted. The bowl of chips stayed untouched, and the hum of the TV kept reminding me that once you start pulling threads on a sweater, the whole thing can unravel in front of the neighbors. We arrived at the Brookfield Club at 8:13 p.m., under chandeliers that made every fork and wine glass sing, and I remember the smell of seared steak and lemon polish like it was a punch in the face. Patricia and Edward greeted us at the head table with those patient smiles hosts where when they're pretending everything is fine, and the dining room hummed polite conversation like a machine that had never known a real problem. I cut into my steak because doing something normal felt like an anchor. The knife scraped the plate, the juice pooled, and the hot iron smell mixed with butter and a trace of rosemary. Riley sat beside me with that podcast glow still on her cheeks, and she tapped her napkin like a metronome waiting for permission to start. As the first course came, Riley gave that tiny speech she'd copied from the Midnight Manifesto, a smile so bright it wanted applause, and she announced, softer this time, "We're sticking to radical honesty tonight." The table tilted into a silence that felt rehearsed. I felt my phone under the napkin by my plate, heavy as a secret, and I could taste horseradish at the back of my throat from the crab starter. I had been staring at the numbers in my head all afternoon, the same numbers that tasted like a betrayal, $6,400. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a ledger entry, an ugly accounting that had been sitting in our joint account labeled business expenses. I don't like escalating in public, but the club was full of people who had watched our story from the cheap seats for years, cousins, friends, colleagues, so I said it out loud slow, like slicing into the truth with the same knife I used on my steak. Last year, Riley submitted $6,400 in charges to our account labeled as business expenses. I told them, and my voice felt calm and simple in a way that surprised me. They weren't for business. They were payments and gifts to a creator named Sky. I named the platform the way you name a wound, direct and unadorned, and the air shifted like someone had cut the lights in a theater. You could hear Patricia drop her wine glass before she actually did, like the sound cornered itself in the room and decided it could not be held. It shattered into bright white shards on the thick carpet and everyone went still like someone had paused a record. Edward's face went betrayed in a way a photo can't catch, color flooded and then left his cheeks as if he'd been winded. Riley's hand found my knee under the table and she punched it, hard, a private, reflexive warning, but my hand didn't move. The server stopped mid-pour, and even the chandeliers seemed to pause in sympathy. Some of the people at the table looked at me as if I'd thrown a stone through a window. Others had the look of people who'd always suspected rain but had hoped for sunshine. I told them the specifics because names and numbers are the bones of proof. It was about $2,400 in direct tips, the little thank you pushes you can make on a platform, monthly subscriptions that added up to about $1,200, roughly $1,800 in Amazon, wishlist purchases shipped to a PO box and bought with our debit card, and about $1,000 wired out to a storefront in Tucson that sold merchandise for creators. Every item and transfer I listed made a little sound in the room, forks paused, conversation thinned, someone clinked ice in a glass too loudly. My phone, which had been trying to be anonymous on the table, finally insisted. It pinged with a bright alert right as I named Tucson, the bank's message blazing on the screen so everyone could see. It read, cold and binary. Alert, possible fraud detected, $6,400 charge posted to account ending 4321. Reply yes to confirm. The timing felt almost theatrical, like a bad joke turned documentary. If the charges felt like theft, the delivery that arrived on our porch that afternoon felt like comedy in poor taste. A courier had dropped off a hulking, jacuzzied inflatable, one of those ridiculous hot tubs with cup holders, stamped with a For Sky giveaway sticker. It sat in cardboard like a farce on our welcome mat, the box sweating in the August heat. I had taken a picture and turned it on the table between courses, more to anchor us to evidence than to embarrass anyone, but the picture did the work on its own. A huge, stupid tub that could have bought a month's groceries, now a prop in someone else's performance. Laughter bubbled up from a cousin at the end of the table, shocked and brittle, and then stopped because there was nothing funny about the cost of this betrayal. Riley gasped, then tried to laugh, then went quiet as the room rearranged itself around the fact that our marriage had quietly been financing someone else's content. Patricia whispered, furious and small, "How could you? and Edward's hand went to his throat like he had to steady a sudden wave. I kept my voice even because honesty asked for clarity and because keeping calm felt like mercy at that point. The country club, with its linens and etiquette and soft carpet, felt suddenly like a courtroom built of polite china, and the $6,400 was the first piece of evidence on the table. We walked into the kitchen after the country club like soldiers returning to a battered tent, the smell of lemon cleaner and cigarette smoke from the valet still on our coats, and the house went quiet in that heavy way that means something's broken. Riley clung to her purse like a rope, and I could feel the adrenaline in my palms. My phone buzzed in my pocket like a live thing. I set the $6,400 picture on the counter like evidence, and there was no ceremony, only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic on the street. "Call Brandon," Riley said suddenly, sharp and loud enough to cut through the quiet, like she thought calling her brother could stitch the night back together. She called him with that breathy, quick voice people use when they're trying to be in control while being terrified, and I slipped into the living room to get distance. The house turned into a war room in an hour, papers spread over the dining table, bank statements stacked like bricks, sticky notes with times and sites and little arrows. Edward began to call, the first voicemail coming in at 9:41 p.m., his voice raw and accusing. "Jason," he said, clipped and furious, "what did you do? You've humiliated us, you've destroyed our family tonight, think about what you've done." He left another at 9:49, more worked up, fumes of anger and disbelief layering over each other. The messages were short, sharp, and full of entitlement, like he couldn't imagine his own choices getting air. Meanwhile, Patricia hovered in the hallway, wrapped in a shawl she never wore inside, and she refused to look at me like I was a stain she couldn't scrub out. She moved around me with that cold politeness people use when something is too ugly to meet eye to eye. She opened her mouth once to say something that died on her lips. Then she turned and left the room, hands pressed flat to her own chest as if trying to keep herself from collapsing. The kitchen felt smaller by the minute, like cloth being folded and refolded until there was no space left. Paper smelled faintly of printer dust and coffee, and the steady drip of the kitchen faucet sounded like a metronome counting down patience. Then the thing that made my stomach drop. A bright Instagram story popped into my feed at 10:07 p.m., public and ordinary in the worst way. A young woman, 28, pushing a stroller down a sunlit street in Orlando, smiling at the camera like this was the best day of her life. The tag read at Edward, and there in the background hung a nursery bumper with cartoon animals, pink and blue like a private life staged for public consumption. Her left hand flashed a ring in the close-up, not an engagement ring like you slow-motion see in rom-coms, but obvious enough to mean something real to someone. I screenshot it without thinking, my thumb leaving a print on the glass like a small, modern fingerprint of proof. I forwarded the screenshot to Riley with my hands shaking just a little, fingers too used to the phone to process the betrayal it held. Her face changed in an instant when she saw it, first confusion, then a look like someone had been smacked hard in the chest, then panic setting her jaw. She ripped my phone from my hand like she'd been struck, and she typed to her mother halting, clumsy keystrokes that told a story even before the words settled. "Traffic on I-4, she wrote, then hesitated and backspaced twice, then typed the same words again and hit send with a thumb that trembled. Tears spilled down her face immediately, salty tracks on skin, and she deleted the message, then retyped it, then deleted it again as if the lie tasted wrong even to her fingertips. She kept typing the fake because the lie was a reflex, an old muscle memory of protecting a family image even while she demanded transparency for herself. I watched her, and the whiplash between what she had preached and what she clung to was brutal enough to make me wince. Riley wanted honesty when it was a sermon to be preached to the world, but when honesty cut at who she loved and who she was connected to, she folded it back into secrecy. Hearing her apologize into her hands, while still composing a lie for her mother, felt like watching someone patch a leaking roof with duct tape while the house filled with smoke. It was ugly, human, and absolutely revealing. The woman who had thrust truth at me like a blade could not accept the blade's direction when it aimed at her own heart. I drove to the bank 3 blocks from our house at 10:38 a.m. because when someone sneaks money, you don't wait to find out if they'll take more. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like the air in my lungs had been measured and rationed. I sat in the teller line and watched a woman 2 people ahead of me argue about a bounced check, the kind of small humiliation that made me glad this was anonymous. I told myself I was not stealing, I was surviving. Before I went in, I called Maya Reynolds at 10:22 a.m., the divorce attorney a friend recommended, and her assistant squeezed me into an emergency consult for that afternoon at 2:00 p.m. on West Parker Street. I said everything as plainly as I could over the phone. What I knew, the $6,400, the Instagram post with the stroller, and that I needed to protect what was ours now. Maya's voice was practical, no judgment, and she told me exactly what I should do first. Get independent finances, document transactions, and don't touch accounts that were solely hers without counsel. At the bank, I opened a personal checking account with a small linoleum teller who stamped forms like a jeweler sets stones, asking for my driver's license and 2 proofs of address. The cashier had a little knowing smile when she handed me the stickered folder of bank forms like a folder that had seen every kind of marriage break. She wrote my name carefully, slid me a pen that had been warmed by other hands, and said, "Everything look okay," in a voice that had the softness of someone who'd signed too many signatures at the end of hard days. I transferred exactly $4,200, $50% of our joint emergency savings, into that new account at 11:07 a.m., watching the numbers move on the teller screen like a counter of sanity. The transfer felt illegal in a moral way and vital in a practical way, like taking a life preserver off a sinking ship. I filled out the transfer slip, initialed in 2 places, and the bank printed a receipt that smelled faintly of toner. I kept the receipt in my wallet like a talisman and told myself we were building a small, honest bunker. While I did this, Riley drove to the coffee shop down the street to talk to her mother and left the house hollower than she'd left it 10 minutes earlier. She looked through the window when I pulled out of the driveway like someone watching a house she no longer recognized. She texted me that Patricia had stepped out of the cafe and wouldn't take calls, the words short and sharp. Later, I learned Patricia had walked out without answering calls, slamming a door I hadn't heard but felt in every part of the afternoon, which made the house feel even emptier when Riley returned. Edward, meanwhile, started calling me in the afternoon, and his tone went from shocked to violent fast. He left voicemails between 3:14 and 4:02 p.m. accusing me of trying to destroy them and threatening legal action. The anger curdled quickly into a different offer. At 4:18 p.m., Edward texted his lawyer's number and then, separately, sent a message offering hush money if we would keep everything quiet. I played the messages for Maya, who listened without blinking, and she said quietly that offering hush money was practically an admission of guilt and would be treated as evidence if things went to court. Maya walked me through leaving a paper trail, document calls, save screenshots, and don't accept cash under the table. She explained the difference between defensive moves and charges that look like theft, and she reassured me that moving half of the emergency fund into a new personal account was prudent, not petty, especially given the pattern I had uncovered. She scheduled a follow-up meeting for 10:30 a.m. next Tuesday to file temporary orders if needed, and to draw up a clear separation agreement the week after. The day closed with me booking therapy because survival needed repair as much as protection. At 5:50 p.m. I called and scheduled a joint session with Dr. Simone Park for both of us on Monday at 4:00 p.m., and I set an individual follow-up for myself with her on Thursday at 10:00 a.m. Making those appointments felt like a small, soft landing. Practical steps, names on a calendar, a plan that wasn't a reaction but a scaffold. I went to bed that night with receipts in a drawer and the quiet knowledge that I had chosen boundaries over chaos, which felt like the only honest thing left to do. The couple's session felt like an ambush the minute we sat down under the neutral light of Dr. Simone Park's office and Riley announced, voice tight, that she wanted total transparency right now. Like the old rules were a leash she was ready to snap. The first 20 minutes were clipped, polite, small things like who forgot to pay a bill. But by the half-hour mark my chest tightened and my voice got flat when I said aloud what I had been nursing. That I'd been managing other people's emotions since I was a kid, smoothing edges so other people could be comfortable. Dr. Park listened without blinking, her pen resting on the pad, and when I finally named that pattern, it felt like the first honest thing I'd ever given myself permission to speak. Riley stormed out 20 minutes later after Dr. Park suggested that demanding brutal honesty can be used as a tool to control someone's narrative, not always to heal. The room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner when she left, a hollow space that matched the hollow sound of the departure. After she slammed the door, I stayed and talked to Dr. Park alone. She said plainly that Riley had weaponized the honesty demand, shaping a moral high ground that let her excavate everything around her while deflecting scrutiny back toward me. The words hit like cold water and something in me unclenched while another part tightened. I had spent my life avoiding storms for other people because it felt safer than being the cause. That night I made practical choices like I was patching a roof after a storm. I booked movers and signed a lease for a 1-bedroom 20 minutes from my office in a building with a doorman and good reviews. The lease signing felt clinical, a small act of self-care disguised as paperwork. The landlord's handshake was curt, the kind of brief grip that says business, not buddy. His office smelled of printer toner and lemon oil, and he slid a welcome packet across the desk like a bandage. I ordered extra deadbolts and a small security camera that links to my phone. And when the hardware arrived, the rasp of packing tape and the hollow sound of suitcases being zipped felt like the soundtrack of leaving. I packed in a careful, steady way that surprised me, labeling boxes, folding shirts the way my grandmother taught me, sealing each box with the same rasp of tape until my fingers felt numb and practiced. The movers came at 9 in the morning and the bags sounded blunt as logs as they hit the truck. I watched the doorman take down my forwarding address and feel steady in a way I hadn't since the first podcast episode hit our bedroom speaker. I also put a small camera on the porch and linked it to my phone, the feed bright and blunt on the screen. And I texted the building manager a note about notifying security if Riley appeared at the door. The call started the week I moved. Midnight became a new kind of war. Riley called nonstop one night and left 43 voicemails between 11:58 p.m. and 3:12 a.m., a loop of pleading, anger, and threats of self-harm that sounded like someone alternately begging for help and trying to punish me into staying. Her voice was ragged and changing, and I could hear alcohol in it on the last few messages. I forwarded all 43 to Maya Reynolds at 3:20 a.m. because Maya had told me to keep every scrap of evidence and to never answer in a way that would escalate. Maya replied with a single line, "Do not engage, document, we will file if needed." The legal advisor was calm and precise like a lighthouse when the waves were trying to take the shore. The night Riley showed up at my building drunk, it felt like a slow pitch thrown in the dark. The doorman called me at 1:41 a.m. and said she was there unsteady, asking to be let in. Security met her on the sidewalk and the police arrived within 20 minutes because the manager had requested assistance. They talked with her on the steps, voices low and professional, and then they removed her from the property after she refused to leave calmly. She was taken a short ways down the street, and then released with officers' advice to sober up and seek help. The sound of their radios and boots faded into the night like a closing chapter. Maya filed for a temporary restraining order that next morning, and at the hearing a magistrate signed it. Riley was ordered to stay at least 600 feet away from me and my workplace until further notice. The order felt like a strange kind of mercy, a legal boundary that finally kept the air between us from being a battlefield. Standing there with that paper in my hand, receipts and voicemails filed on my phone, and Dr. Park's notes folded in my bag, I felt a painful relief. No triumph, just the clean line between safety and chaos. The move, the locks, the camera, the lawyer calls, and Dr. Park's hard truths were not revenge. They were the scaffolding I needed to breathe and to begin living honestly again. Maya sat across from me with a stack of manila folders that made the coffee table look like a courthouse prop, her pen tapping a steady beat while she laid out what she had found, and the smell of toner, legal ink, and old paper felt oddly comforting. She had subpoenaed bank records, tracked wire transfers to the Tucson storefront, pulled screenshots of the Amazon shipments, and dug up an account Riley had quietly opened under her mother's maiden name with $12,500 in it. A hidden savings cushion that none of our joint budgeting ever mentioned. The file also contained the 43 voicemails, the screenshots from Instagram, and a log of the credit card alerts. Maya held the proof up like evidence under a lamp, simple and loud, and I felt the room shrink to the space between us and the truth. We sat in the courthouse at 9 on a Wednesday with a calendar page still smelling faintly of the courtroom's lemon polish and old wood, and Judge Morneau read the papers like someone clearing a schedule. Maya presented the file with methodical care. Bank transfers, the Tucson merchant receipts, the deliveries to a P.O. box, and the pattern of after-midnight voicemails showing harassment. The defense tried to frame it as misunderstanding, as gifts miscategorized, but the receipts had names, times, and numbers, and the voice messages were time-stamped evidence of the threats and the escalation. You could hear the rustle of paper like distant rain, and the judge's gavel came down with the dry finality of winter branches snapping. When the judge rendered his decision, it felt both anticlimactic and monumental. He awarded me primary possession of the house on Maple Street, the bulk of our joint savings, including the $6,000 that remained easily accessible, and 2 years of alimony at $1,200 a month to help with the transition. The order was clean on the page, a list of things and responsibilities, and it felt less like winning and more like being given the chance to breathe. Riley sat a few rows behind me, hands clenched in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together. And when her lawyer suggested mediation for anything else, I stayed quiet because there was no appetite left in me to argue over silverware. Shortly after the decision, Riley checked into an outpatient program focused on impulse control and compulsive spending. I learned about the program from Patricia's text, a brittle message that said, "She's getting help." And I remember the way those words sounded both like a relief and an accusation. A few weeks later, a long, excuse-filled letter arrived in the mail, pages of reasons, apologies that circled without really landing, and a few attempts to explain that the podcast had unlocked things she couldn't control. I read it once on the porch with my hands wrapped around a mug that was still warm from the kettle, and then I folded it back up and set it in the recycling bin without answering. Some replies aren't for you, I thought. They are for a ledger only she can balance. Life after the courtroom was quieter in ways I hadn't expected, less dramatic and more ordinary. I sleep through the night now without waking to check the back door or listen for a phone buzzing. There is a clean silence at 2 in the morning that feels like a small marriage to myself. I meet friends for lunch on Wednesdays, the way I used to years ago, and the conversations are ordinary and bright. Sam brings terrible jokes, and Olivia brings a bottle of hot sauce she swears will change my life. I accept breakfast invites I used to decline because I worried they'd ask questions I couldn't answer. And Dr. Park keeps guiding the next steps with a steady, practical plan that is part therapy and part reintegration. On a Saturday in early spring, I passed a park bench, and a woman was laughing loudly with a toddler who kept pointing at dogs like each one was a miracle. And I paused because it struck me how loud and real their moment was. The sunlight hit the toddler's hair, and the woman's laugh filled the space between the swings. For the first time in years, I breathed without running the calculation of how other people would respond. The truth Riley wanted had not brought the romantic revelation she imagined. It didn't make us saints or martyrs, but it cleared a path out. It was messy and brutal and shocking, yes, but it was also freeing in a way that left room for small, clean pleasures. Coffee that tasted like coffee, sleep that stayed put, and a life rebuilt around boundaries I had finally learned to keep.